Let's get into the news. As I mentioned, Joe Biden had a press conference, not a press conference, a town hall conference yesterday, and there was a lot of reaction to it. There were clips flying around. Joe Biden was talking about China and President Xi Jinping and the Uyghurs and all sorts of big, broad issues that have been catching a lot of traction on Twitter. And so we thought, well, we're going to ignore some of those main clips. They're interesting, they're provocative, they're concerning, but let's focus on what he talked about as it relates to criminal justice reform. We've been talking about this a lot. This is kind of the crux of the channel, right? Watching the watchers. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. We have a decent sized criminal defense firm here in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we deal with these issues very regularly. And so I was excited to see that there were going to be questions about justice reform. You recall that in 2020, we had months of summer unrest. It's still going on in some parts of the country. We had the George Floyd death. We had Ahmaud Arbery. We had Breonna Taylor. We had Jacob Blake. We had Daniel Prude. And we've covered all of those and more on this channel. And so this has been an issue that's been at the forefront of my mind. But when we heard from Joe Biden yesterday, it didn't really match what I knew of the candidate, what I knew of Joe Biden, because I certainly have been following him for some period of time, because he, as I've said on this channel, he is the godfather of our current criminal justice system. And so I want to explain what this looks like. Before we get into some of the clips, let's lay some context here, because he got a lot of applause last night, and I just don't think that many people know the full breadth of his impact on the justice system. So this story came from the New York Times, and you'll notice this was written back on June 25th, 2019 by Cheryl Gay Stolberg and Astrid Herndon. And, when you see stories like this that are sort of critical about somebody who is now in power, I think it's important to take a look back at the timeline, right? So this would have been really sort of in the early primary stage when Joe Biden was just starting to run for the presidency this time. And so you're going to see a lot of these stories that are actually sort of calling him out on his past record. But anything that is new is sort of being whitewashed. And I even went on to Wikipedia here to look at some of his record as they have it there. And they just kind of got rid of his name from a lot of the crime bills. The 1984 crime bill, 1986, I think I saw, but I was just poking around and I didn't see much of it. But the good news is we covered a lot of this previously before the election. And so we're going to be able to revisit some of our prior research. So I wanted to just call your attention to that. So in 2019, it was okay to criticize and condemn Joe Biden for his record, but now not so much, right? Now that he is the official de facto, he's the president, he's the leader of the Democratic Party. Now, all of the little, newspapers and websites and Wikipedia editors, now they're making sure that he's nice and fortified and protected. But this article came back in 2019 before that was the modus operandi. And so it says here, Joe Biden said, lock the S.O.B.s up. Joe Biden in the era of mass incarceration. He now plays down his role overhauling crime laws with segregationist senators in the 80s and 90s. That portrayal today is at odds with his actions and rhetoric back then. In September 94, President Clinton signed the new Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, known as the 1994 Crime Bill, in an elaborately choreographed ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House. Joe Biden sat directly behind the president's lectern, flashing his trademark grin. For Mr. Clinton, the law was an immediate follow-through on his campaign promise to focus more on federal attention on crime prevention. But for Biden, the moment was the culmination of his decades-long effort to closely marry the Democratic Party and law enforcement and to transform the country's criminal justice system. In the process, he had won. And he said, the truth is, Mr. Biden had boasted a year earlier in a speech on the Senate floor, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden. That's his own statement, right? And that is exactly right. That's exactly true, which is why I call him the godfather of mass incarceration. He's the godfather of the modern American judicial system, the justice system as we see and know it today, the one that I'm practicing in. We've got several different attorneys here, all practicing in it. We got a whole team of people. It's the byproduct of what Joe and his people did back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so we got to just remember that. So in my humble opinion, sort of a come to Jesus moment, sort of a, whoa, we kind of screwed that up, mea culpa. view that in context. I'm happy that he is now coming to the light. Happy now that he's seeing the error of his ways. But the question is, now that he's the president of this country and he has the House of Representatives and the Congress in terms of the Senate, is he going to do anything to actually unring this bell? Is he going to unwind the clock a little bit so that we can solve these issues? Or are we going to hear just more bloviating from the Democratic Party, just like we hear from the Republican Party? So let's go through Joe Biden's record just briefly. We've talked about this before on the channel. If you doubt my sources on any of this stuff, you can go look it up, download these slides. You can find them. This information comes from Vox.com, from Slate.com, News and Politics from 2015, 2019, Joe Biden, the crime bill law, mass incarceration, why the presidential run's a bad idea. All of this stuff came from before he was the nominee and, of course, the president. So go back and find those articles if you want. But Joe Biden was elected to the Senate in 1972. Then in 1984, he was the original co-sponsor of the Comprehensive Control Act. Okay, 1984, 1 year before 1985, the year I was born. Joe Biden then on 1986 was also the original co-sponsor and the co-author of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. And we're going to hear about drugs because Joe Biden was talking about it last night. Then a couple years later, that wasn't good enough. So they needed another one in 1988, where Joe Biden was once again a co-sponsor, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And we're going to go through, I'm going to briefly bring you up to speed on what each one of these acts are. Then in 1994, this was the big one. This was the 1994 crime bill that he's gotten a lot of grief over. Haven't paid much attention to his other bills, but 1994 in conjunction with all the 84, the 86, the 88 bill are all bad. And the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, Joe Biden was the sponsor and the author of the bill. And after this point in time, after that all came into effect, this was one of his, he would tout this point all the time. He would say, yeah, we solve crime. And what we're going to do now is just transition. We're going to listen to Joe Biden at the town hall last night. You're going to see that a public defender asks him a question, and pay attention to the question and then pay attention to the response that we're going to get from Joe Biden. He gives us a 3-point solution. This young man who's a public defender comes up, asks him a question. What are we going to do about this? And he gives us 3 points. So pay attention. We're going to break those down. This is a longer-ish clip. I think it's about 4 minutes. I do not want to take him out of context. I do not want people to be saying that we're doing like a gotcha show here. I was going to clip this up into 30 seconds and 60 seconds and just point response, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to let him go for 4 minutes, flesh out his whole policy proposal, then we'll critique it in the next segment. So here is Joe Biden over from last night.
If I say anything you don't like, let me know right away, will you?
All right, you're all right.
As big as a mountain.
Good evening, President Biden. I was a public defender in Kenosha County when the police shot Jacob Blake. I witnessed the city I worked in burned and devastated, and recently District Attorney Michael Gravely denied to prosecute the police officers responsible. So my question to you is, what will your administration do to correct these wrongs that we witnessed not just in Kenosha, but across this country? And what will we do to bridge the gap between communities and their police?
3 things. First of all, I was a public defender as well. And I think it's high time that we had public defenders being paid the same as prosecutors.
That's one.
My son, by the way, was a great prosecutor. He was the Attorney General of the state of Delaware, and he was a federal prosecutor before that. And so I'm not condemning all prosecutors, but I am saying that it matters that you have adequate defense and you are able to attract people who, in fact, can live on being able to be that public defender. Number one. Number two, we are pushing very hard, and I think we'll get it done, is the legislation relating to what is appropriate police behavior and studying police behavior and coming down with recommendations that are consistent with the legislation that was put in place as a consequence of all the world seeing one man shoved up against a curb and murdered after 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And so there's a number of things relating to everything from no-knock warrants and a whole range of things you know. There's legislation that's being introduced separately. I hope it will pass. But thirdly, I think we have to deal with systemic racism that exists throughout society. And one of the things I'm going to recommend there is that we look at an entire panoply of things that affect whether or not people of color primarily are treated differently. And that goes for everything from prosecutorial discretion. You know, as a public defender, by that I mean, what happens is, it will take too long to go through the whole explanation, but let me try to do it quickly. What happens now is, if you in fact are you arrest someone because they had, you want to charge them, you can charge them with robbery or armed robbery. You charge them with armed robbery, you get a lot more time than if you don't charge with robbery. But if you want to make sure that someone who doesn't know much about their representation is able to be done, you engage in prosecutorial misconduct by offering them to plead to essentially, it's not the same, burglary, which gets them 2 years and probation. And so you don't even get a trial. You plead because you don't have adequate representation. You feel like everything's against you, and you're in trouble. When I did the Sentencing Act, that was designed to make sure we had the same time for the same crime. As chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I looked at all 10 federal districts, and we took 6 months to do it, and found out if you're black and you were your first time offense of being accused of burglary, and maybe you committed it, and you were white, and you did the same exact crime. In all 10 districts throughout the United States of America, the person, and don't hold me the exact numbers, but the percentages are right. If you were a first-time white guy, you'd get 2 years. You get 7 years if you were black. So in order to make sure that you could not send people to jail for the same crime, I came up with this sentencing commission, which said that everybody who commits the crime has to receive between, instead of 0 to 20 years, you drastically cut down the number of years you could go to jail, but say you have to, if it's a first-time offense, you have to get sentenced between 1.5 and 3 years, okay? Well, what happens is prosecutors use that as a mechanism to send people to jail, and makes it look like we're dealing with mandatory sentencing, which it wasn't designed to do at all. It was designed to make sure that people were treated fairly. I'm sorry to go on. There's much more to talk about, but
we actually have a
All right, so let me go ahead and translate that for you if you had trouble following him along. Number one, first of all, well, before we get to number one, the person was asking him a question specifically about Jacob Blake. Says, look, this officer shot the guy in the back. Gravely, the district attorney said, you didn't do anything wrong, so we're not going to press charges against the officer. Now, if you've been a follower of this channel for some time, you'll notice that we went back and we were actually on the side of Jacob Blake. Many people were not happy with us about that. Most of our most downvoted videos ever, people were so mad, was about Jacob Blake, but we just went through the facts and that was my opinion on it. And so this public defender comes out and says, listen, what are you going to do about this? He shot somebody in the back 7 times who was basically running away from him. And now we want you to go and fix this. How are you going to fix this? He defaults to, well, we're going to just pay the public defenders more. So you guys are going to handle that. That's number one. Public defenders get paid more. Number two, they're also going to want to get better police officers, which we've already been talking about. Everybody wants that, and those policy changes have already been underway. Thank you, Joe. We understand that. What he says is we're going to go through, we're going to do a deep study, we're going to investigate what the problems are, then we'll make some more recommendations. And we've already done all of that. I'm so sick and tired of the investigations and the studies and everything. Okay, we know what the problems are. We've already talked about them ad nauseum here. We've talked about qualified immunity. We've talked about mandatory body cameras. We've talked about dealing with the police unions. We've talked about absolute disclosure requirements so that we know who the bad cops are, making some of this stuff publicly available, Brady registries, sharing of data from one agency to another, on and on and on and on. None of that, though. They're going to go study it again, which is just great. So that is very nice. Then we have just another issue of just general systemic racism, which, okay, I can understand that. I understand why that's a political issue. I'm not trying to deny that there isn't any systemic racism or any racism that exists in law enforcement or in our judicial system. But I will tell you this, I see bad things as a criminal defense attorney happen to all people, not just the blacks, the Hispanics, the whites, the Asians. It's everybody. It's across the board. It's a police problem as much as it is anything else. And nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to acknowledge that maybe there's a cultural problem. Okay, I see black cops beating up on black people. I see white cops wrecking white people. I see it all across the board. It's a justice problem. It's a law enforcement problem, but they're just going to go back to systemic racism. So in my opinion, 3 non-answers, but that is to be expected. We did learn that, public defenders should get more money. I totally agree with that. And I think that there should be some serious public defender advocacy going on. I just learned recently from a guy on Twitter named Nate Wade, who was telling us, I've never been a public defender. I went right into private practice, but basically they have a lot of limitations on what they can say. They can't go out there and advocate while prosecutors can. So on that point, I agree with that, right? We could absolutely help and support public defenders more. And I've been an advocate for them. A lot of people are come down on public defenders. They say they're public pretenders and stuff like that. And I say, absolutely not. That's not fair. That's not appropriate. So, largely a non-answer. And he was sort of just meandering through it. He also talked a little bit about, if you didn't catch it, he talked about mandatory sentencing. And specifically, he says, well, that was not something that I intended it for it to be that way. He said, black people were being incarcerated and giving much more serious sentences than white people were. 10 years over here, 1 year over here. And so we wanted to just go ahead and modify some of this stuff so that it was more equal. Right? It was more equivalent. These are Joe Biden's 3 plans, or his 3-point solution: pay public defenders more, hire better police officers after they do a deep dive investigation, and then end systemic racism, which is all sounds great, sounds good. Not going to solve any of the problems that the questioner was asking him about. Right? Or maybe it would, I don't know. But let's take a look at Joe Biden, what he's mentioning about sentencing, mandatory sentencing and sentencing reform. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to show you all the different crime bills that Joe Biden was a part of. We're going to refresh those, but I wanted to just pause and show you something that we use here in Arizona. It's called a sentencing chart, and it looks like this. And I've explained how this works to a number of people in sort of different settings, and most people are often shocked about this. They just don't understand why this happens. And so what you may have noticed is that you see a couple boxes here, right? And they look like complicated boxes. This is Arizona's sentencing chart. And the way that we do things here is, if it's a non-dangerous offense, you get categorized based on whatever level felony you've been charged with. So in Arizona, up until very recently, marijuana violations were Class 6 felonies. We just legalized those, legalized most marijuana offenses. If you get an aggravated DUI, you're going to be right here, okay? It's a Class 4 felony. And what can happen is, if you are sentenced according to this chart, well, how does it work, right? If you're a first offense, you say this P right here is called the presumptive term, the presumptive prison term. And you just use the chart. You just go down the chart. Okay, Class 4 felony. What is the presumptive term? 2.5 years in prison. All right. Even though there are some special rules for DUIs and how those work in Arizona. But generally speaking, if you're charged with a Class 4, Class 3, Class 5, whatever it is, you just figure out what class you're in. And this is part of what Joe Biden installed. I mean, he didn't come to Arizona and do this, but this is all remnants of the 1994 crime bill and all of the prior bills. So down here, you may have heard of this concept of 3 strikes, a 3 strikes rule, right? Category 1, this would be considered sort of a first strike. Then you've got Category 2, sort of a second strike, and then a Category 3 would be a third strike. You're now a repetitive offender because you've got prior felonies. And so let's say that you've been charged with a Class 4 felony, maybe possession of narcotic drugs, for example, and on your first offense, where you're eligible for probation, then you don't go to prison for that. But if you come back and you've got a prior felony conviction on your record, now you've got 2.5 year presumptive term that you're looking at. Do it again, it goes up to 4.5 years. Do it again, you're looking at 10 years now, right? Sort of the 3 strikes rule. 3 strikes, Class 4 felony, possession of narcotic drugs, possession of dangerous drugs, happens all the time. They're sending these people to prison for years, for 4.5 years in this case, on a second offense, 10 years on a third offense. And it's just something that is abhorrent to me. Now, when we're talking about mandatory sentencing, then you'll notice that this is just the presumptive term, right? This is sort of where everybody is starting equal. The P stands for presumptive. The government is going to want to increase that. So let's say it's a second offense. You've already got 1 eligible prior. So it's 4.5 years. That is the prison term. The government can ask for as much as 7.5. So they'll try to get a maximum of 6, and they can aggravate the case so you get 7.5. The defense wants to minimize that. So they want to push this back down towards the minimum or the mitigated term of 2.25. And so this whole structure is exactly what Joe Biden is talking about. Now, the reason they put this in place is because they wanted people to operate within the boxes. right? They didn't want, like Joe Biden was saying, they did not want somebody who was black over here for a judge just to say, oh, some white judge say, I don't like that black guy, so I'm going to give him 25 years. Well, that's not on the chart, right? That's not in the box. So if you box people in on this, then that's good. You don't get those real maximum, really egregious, outside of the ordinary, allegedly racist sentences. But conversely now, let's say you do have a drug addict, somebody who is an addict, somebody who has a serious substance abuse problem, and now they've gotten in trouble a few times. They also have to fall within the confines of these boxes. They cannot get out of the boxes. So let's say somebody comes back, they've got 3 prior drug offenses, they clean their act up, but they're a category 3 offender. And this has happened. I've worked on cases like this where somebody will be a category 3 offender because in Arizona, we have what's called a 7-year statute of limitations on drug charges, which means you can be charged for a crime 7 years later. So let's say you're a drug addict and for 3 years, you got in a lot of trouble. You got arrested, you got all these things, all these charges pending, filed up against you. You get clean 2 years later, haven't used drugs, totally sober, working a program, helping the community, married, kids, house, whatever. They can bring those charges back up and charge you up to 7 years later. And that has happened. So now they come back and a person who's a category 3 offender is now facing 10 years in prison, okay? 10 years. And when you talk to a prosecutor about this and you say, hey, my client's very good. This person is a recovered addict. They're not a criminal. And they say, oh, well, that's really great. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you an offer. The presumptive term is 10 years. Okay, you can only go to, if you went to trial and lost, you'd go to prison for 10 years. But since your client is a recovered addict, what we're going to do is we're going to give him the minimum sentence. We're going to go down to 8 years in prison. And you're going, wait, what? He's been sober for 2 years. He's got a wife, 2 kids, a job, the whole thing. You want to send him back to prison for charges that happened 5 years ago? And they say, hey, well, sorry. There's nothing we can do about that because look here, ARS 13703J says, well, we got to operate within these confines. If the defense says, okay, well, we want the mitigated term, that's still 6 years. Okay, it's still 6 years in custody, 6 years in prison. And according to Joe Biden, according to what we're going to go through, this is all the framework from the 1994 crime bill, 1986, 1984, 1982. This created this entire structure throughout the entirety of the country. So we're going to hear from Joe here in a minute that says, well, if you're charged with a drug crime, you shouldn't go to prison at all. So just keep that in mind, right? This is something that he was a part of. And I know it was a long time ago. I know Reagan signed the 80s bills into law. I know this was a whole countrywide movement that both parties wanted this reform to be passed. And Joe Biden was just the spearheader of it. But he was the spearhead of it, right? This is critical to his judgment. This is something that he pushed through and he was proud of it. Year after year after year. This wasn't a one bill in 1994. It was a whole slew of bills. Now, today, fast forward, suddenly the political winds have changed, and he is going to sort of be out there advocating for some major changes in policy. And we're all just supposed to forget about this? I live this. Well, my whole office lives this every single day. Here is Joe Biden from last night, now suddenly saying, well, we shouldn't put people who do drugs in jail. We're going to go back through his record here in a second, but here is Joe from last night.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Defund the police is discussed as an option for reforming policing. However, there are communities where people live in fear, not of the police, but in fear of the violent gangs who commit crimes in those neighborhoods. How can we be sure that we don't over-legislate police officers so that they can't do their job to protect the law-abiding citizens who live in these high-crime neighborhoods, and yet train officers to police with compassion?
By number one, not defunding the police. We have to put more money in police work. So we have legitimate community policing, and we're in a situation where we change the legislation. No one should go to jail for a drug offense.
Yeah, I agree.
No one should go to jail for the use of a drug. They should go to drug rehabilitation. Drug rehabilitation.
Cheers, 2021, Joe.
We should be in a
Cheers.
position where we change the system of sentencing system to one that relates to a notion of, they should tell you that, is related to making sure that what you do is you focus on making sure that there's rehabilitation. The idea that we don't have people in prison systems learning how to be spending the money, learning how to be mechanics, learning how to be cooks, learning how to have a profession when you get out. The idea that we deny someone who served their time access to Pell Grants, access to housing, access to, right now, as you well know, most places you get out of prison, you get 25 bucks on a bus ticket. You end up back under the bridge exactly where you were before. And the fact is that the concern in many minority communities is black on black, Hispanic on Hispanic, not just, but here's the deal. There has to be much more serious, how can I say, much more serious determination as to what the background and the attitudes of the recruit is, what their views are. There should be much more psychological testing, like you would if you go into the intelligence community. What is it? What are the things that make you respond the way you do? Because there is inherent prejudice built into the system as well. And we also need to provide for, and it's happening, more African American and more Hispanic police officers. Now, by the way, they don't get it all right either, by a long shot. But every cop, when they get up in the morning and put on that shield, has a right to expect to be able to go home to their family that night. Conversely, every kid walking across the street wearing a hoodie is not a member of a gang and is about to knock somebody off.
Yep.
So it's about education. I'd love to talk to you more about it because it is the answer, in my view, that and education, actually access to education. And one of the things that I talk a lot about, and I'm sorry to go on about this, but it's important, I don't think we can look at opportunity in the, let's stick with the African American community for a minute, in terms of the criminal justice system. That is only one small piece of why people are the way they are. You realize, I don't know what home you live in, but if you go ahead and you want to get insurance and you're in a black neighborhood, you're going to pay more for the same insurance I'm going to pay for the exact same home. Your car, you've never had an accident in your car. You live in a black neighborhood, you're going to pay a higher premium in your car. So there's so many things that are built in institutionally that disadvantage African Americans and Latinos that we fact, I think, and one of the great advantages, I'm sorry to go on, but one of the great advantages, as bad as things are, I keep reading from presidential historians how I've inherited the worst situation since Lincoln, worse than Roosevelt, because economic crisis, political crisis, racial crisis, et cetera. But the fact is that everyone's gotten a close-up look now and seen what's happened. That kid holding that camera for 8 minutes and 46 seconds awakened the whole world. When I met with his little daughter after he was dead, she said, "My daddy's changed the world." Guess what? Not only here in the United States, around the world, people said, "Whoa, I didn't know that happened." Dr. King, when my generation, when I got involved in the civil rights movement as a high school student in the early 60s, and you had Bull Connor and his dogs in the late 50s singing on those ladies going to, in their black dresses going to church and little kids.
All right, I have no idea what the hell he's talking about now. So, this is, all right, so let's recap what Joe was talking about there. So, number one, the person asks him specifically about the fear of gangs. He says, well, the police, we don't want to we don't want to tie their hands. They need to go out there and do their job. And he says basically a couple things. He says, well, no jail for drug offenses. All right. So, okay. Then he also says, well, no denial of higher education for the inmates. Then he goes into sort of a third part of his answer where he's talking specifically about psychological profiling for the police. So I didn't think it was actually responsive to the gentleman's question, but that's all right. Then he goes on and he talks about learning and how important it is, psychological testing, and on and on and on. So this is sort of a synopsis of what his solutions are. No jail for drug offenses. And he also says no denial of higher education. And then he also says a little bit more about psychological testing, right? That's sort of a thing in there. It's psychological testing for the police. But don't defund the police, something that I've agreed with a lot. I've talked about this a lot, about higher education. Really, a lot of what he said there, I empathize with. I actually agree with a lot of that. I've said many times on this channel, I don't want people going into custody and coming out worse, coming out even worse off for society. Okay, we don't, the punishment is the removal from society. It is the segregation of them into their own little house. They lose a ton of freedoms. They're not able to go out and spend time with their spouse or go, have a job that's at a normal facility. They are in prison. That is the punishment. But we don't want them to come out worse than when they went in, because we put them in there in the first place because they weren't, apparently good enough for society. They had to be removed from society when they come back into society. Wouldn't it be nice if they had a nice skill set? Joe Biden was talking about it. Yeah, cooks and cleaning and all this stuff rather than a $25 and a bus ticket. Totally agree with that. Also, totally agree that nobody should be in jail for drug offenses. Okay, unless they're, manufacturing meth or something like that. That's a separate claim. But if somebody is an addict and they're using drugs, why are we punishing people by throwing them in prison when it's a pain thing, it's an addiction thing? I think there are better ways to deal with that. So let's once again revisit Joe, because he made some pretty nice claims there. This is what he had done previously. These are his bills. Co-sponsor Anti-Drug Abuse Act, 1988, another Anti-Drug Abuse Act, then in 1994. So let's go through some of these, shall we? The 1984 Act, this was the Sentencing Reform Act. This is where we got some of the mandatory sentencing, even though he said it shouldn't have been there. This was an extension of the Secret Service jurisdiction over credit card fraud. But look here, we have increased federal penalties for cultivation, possession, or transfer of marijuana. Right? So that's good. So in 1984, I know it was a long time ago. I get it. And I understand that people's opinions evolve. But there are a lot of people sitting in prison because of this bill that Joe Biden was a co-sponsor on. Then we have the 1986 bill. This was a solution to the recreational drug use, which was to punish the casual user. And if you don't like my phrasing on that, then you can go take a look at the congressional bill, right? This is sort of a synopsis of the bill. Mandatory minimum sentences on the type and quantity of drug used. Then they wanted to increase the penalties for trafficking in synthetic drugs. Then they set mandatory minimum sentences for drugs, including marijuana. This was all done on a federal level, 1986. Go look it up if you want to. Joe Biden was highly involved in that. As he said, every crime bill from 1976 on through 1994 had his name on it. He was leading the charge on it. Then we get 1988. It is the policy that we have a drug-free America. Remember, we got the DARE program and all this stuff going on in schools. It amended the 1986 Act because it wasn't harsh enough. So then what they did is they created a mandatory minimum penalty for first offense possession of crack cocaine. First offense. Lock them up. Lock those S.O.B.s up, according to Joe. And it was for crack cocaine. Do you know what community was hit hardest by the crack cocaine epidemic? The African American community. Do you know what happened to those people on a first offense possession? They went to prison. There are probably still people in prison as a result of what happened under these laws. Joe Biden's the president now. He's got both houses of Congress. Maybe it's time for them to do something about it. Then also, according to this bill, allow the death penalty for anyone murdered during a drug felony. So and then toughen penalties for drug users. That was in the 1988 crime bill. Then we get over to the 1994 bill. This is the largest crime bill in the history of the United States. It consisted of 356 pages, 100,000 new police officers, $9.7 billion in funding for the prisons, $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs. Joe Biden literally drafted the Senate version of the legislation in cooperation with the National Association of Police Organizations. So for over 10 years now at this point in time, he's been just grinding, locking up all the drug addicts, punishing people with mandatory minimums, making sure that sentencing was uniform across the board, set up the framework for the 3 strikes proposals that you see throughout the country, all directly related to Joe Biden. Then today, he's talking about, education. I mean, we got to have education for these people. He goes through, makes a big point of it. I want to make sure that they learn a skill set so they can, improve themselves when they come out of custody. Well, that would have been nice. I would agree with that. I think it's a very nice sentiment. I'm very happy that 2021 Joe Biden is on board with that, because in 1994, that was not the case. Here was an excerpt from Wikipedia. This is still over there on Wikipedia. Go look at it. It says the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, elimination of higher education for inmates. So they literally wrote that into the bill. One of the more controversial provisions of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act overturned a section of the Higher Education Act of 1965, permitting prison inmates to receive a Pell Grant for higher education while they were incarcerated. The amendment is as follows. Subsection A, in general, Section 401B8 of the Higher Education Act is amended to read as follows. Subsection 8, no basic grant shall be awarded under this subpart to any individual who is incarcerated in any federal or state penal institution. It effectively eliminated the ability of low-income prison inmates to receive college educations during their term of imprisonment, thus ensuring education levels of most inmates remain unimproved over the period of their incarceration. So we fast forward now, 20-something years. Now Joe Biden is all on board criminal justice reform. But, folks, I have a hard time just letting this stuff go because it's, quite frankly, I don't think he's going to do anything about it. I think that this is all a bunch of bloviating talk. He's got all three branches he's got the legislative branch, both houses, and the federal White House. He's the president of the country. And he's talking about systemic racism, okay? He passed these laws. These are in writing, recorded in Congress. He can undo all of it. It's very damaging. He's talking about problems that he created over the last 30 years. And we'll see if he does anything about it. But this is one of those things that I just can't let him get away with it. I'm very happy that he is now coming to terms with this. I'm very happy that he's now talking a big game and saying we're going to start looking at some of this stuff. But until it gets done, I'm not going to hold my breath. And anytime he comes out there and starts claiming, that there are other causes of this or that he was not responsible for it, that this is just society that just sort of developed this way. No. For a decade, you were passing literal legislation that was changing the way that we do justice in this country. Now, you got to reap what you sow. The whole country is angry about it. For some reason, I don't know why, but the media just let this stuff all lie low. Donald Trump, to his massive failure, they didn't beat him up over this stuff over the last campaign. But I think if more people knew about what Joe Biden was responsible for in America, all of this malfeasance that we see day in and day out, all of the trials and tribulations that anybody who's been charged with a crime has to go through, the type of work that we do here at our office to help people survive and succeed in the justice system, we're fighting back against Joe Biden's legislative agenda, against his policy. I'm hopeful that it changes, but I'm not going to hold my breath.